Welcome back, everyone. Let's take a brief tour of the modern period in philosophy. So, within the modern period, philosophers do make this distinction of three sub-periods, and Hargrove mentions these periods. First is the early modern period, where two schools of philosophy, rationalism and empiricism, dominated. The second is 19th century philosophy, and the third is the 20th century philosophy. But the basic ideas of these three sub-periods, as far as we are concerned, with respect to the environmental crisis, they are quite common. So we will take them together, as Hargrove does. So modern philosophy took over from medieval philosophy, as we all know. The medieval philosophy was decidedly Christian. Initially, when Christianity came to Europe, there was a break with Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy was not allowed to be taught in Christian West. Later, Plato was reintroduced in Europe, and the two-world theory of Plato became quite attractive to Christians because they also believe in the other world. Hence, the discussion during the early medieval period was centered on the status of universals, basically Platonic forms. Later, when Aristotle was reintroduced to medieval Europe, medieval philosophy philosophers began to discuss Aristotle more than Plato. So early modern philosophy reacted against medieval Aristotelianism because that immediately preceded the birth of modern philosophy. And early modern philosophy created a scientific kind of philosophy, either rather Platonic Pythagorean spirit of privileging abstract knowledge. Not that Aristotle did not privilege abstract knowledge, but at least he had a scientific observational attitude, which also could not really be transferred to the early modern period because of the critique of Aristotelian medieval philosophy. So Aristotelian empiricism and realism was nearly forgotten in the early modern period of philosophy. So during the medieval era, people were used to thinking actually symbolically. The symbolic thinking is very important to have an aesthetic perspective. For example, biblical significance could be thought of when a Christian sees a real fish. However, moderns did not use symbolic thought that strongly. They began to think representationally, which means that natural objects and whatever we see in the world began to be thought of as a representation of an image in our mind. For example, this kind of a tendency is seen realized in modern painting, early modern painting. For example, just before the modern Renaissance painting, as in Michelangelo and all. This kind of painting is very, very realistic. So philosophy studied the relationship between, early modern philosophy studied the relationship between mental and physical objects. Nature became a representational image within the human mind. In this scenario, the first philosopher, the most important modern philosopher who became central to modern thinking in one way or the other throughout the modern period was Rene Descartes. His theory is very often referred to by the phrase Cartesian dualism. Now, our author Hargrove calls Descartes the father of not really modern philosophy, but the father of modern anti-ecological philosophical problems. What are those problems? Suspicion of external world, suspicion of objective value, and suspicion about the nature of science. Oh, it's not really some suspicion of the nature of science, but the type of science that came to be in the early modern period is very Cartesian. Now, Descartes was a rationalist. Rationalist is one who places philosophical significance upon reason and reason alone. So he trusted reason and reason alone as the basis of knowledge, just like Plato. But reason in the sense, reason which not which a reason which finds the forms which are existing in a Platonic world, but reason which looks within itself. Now, he introduced in his famous book, Meditations, he introduced the method of doubt, according to which the thinker, the philosopher begins by doubting everything until he reaches a point, a principle, a self-evident principle which cannot be doubted. For Descartes, when he follows this method, what he arrives at, the self-evident principle, is the cogito principle, what is called the cogito principle. In a statement, it is stated as, I think, therefore I am. The idea is, when I begin to doubt everything, doubt itself is a thought. So I realize that I can doubt my body, I can doubt objects in the world, I can doubt other human beings, but I cannot doubt my thought, the thinker. Therefore, if I doubt that, then the doubt itself goes. That itself becomes doubtable. Therefore, the only certainty that I have as a thinker, as a thinking being, thinking thing, as he calls it, is the principle of the self, my mind. On the basis of this principle, Descartes argues through following rational steps that God also exists. God also exists. You may not agree, but Descartes thinks that he has followed the rational principles to arrive at the existence of God. And he also thinks that by reasoning, he thinks that through God's goodness, our common sense belief in the existence of other human beings and the material world are also true, are made true because of the principle of God. Now, Descartes has many critics. In fact, all the later philosophers are the critics of Descartes. They all challenged in one way or the other Descartes' proofs for the existence of God, most of them. So the world and the others became open to doubt because you take away, if you question the existence of God, then you take away the foundation that supports our experience of others and the world. So the Cartesian principle of certainty only proves that the subject exists and the subject's thoughts are valid. They're true, for at least the subject himself, but not the material being of the world. That is not proved, especially when you take away the principle of God. So the later philosophers took the principle of the self, the Cartesian self, the cogito, for granted, and tried to offer proofs for the existence of God, external world, and others. Now, they could not find successful, they did not succeed in this endeavor, and therefore they were led more and more into skepticism, doubting. So there is an epistemological turn in modern philosophy with Descartes. You do a theory of reality, metaphysics, through an epistemology. That is, you try to understand not whether the world existed or not, but whether it is possible for you to know that the world existed or not. So the reality became a problem of mental representation, as we said earlier. So our whole enterprise, philosophical enterprise, is to find out whether our ideas accurately represented the properties of physical objects that we experience. But all experiences are finally mental representations. This is very much not like the Greeks. So against the Greeks, Descartes believed that there are two kinds of non-permanent matter or substance, not really matter, but substance. One substance is mind and the other substance is matter. Mind, the substance called mind, is extended in space, and the substance called matter is substance called mind is not extended in space, and the substance called matter is extended in space. And it is created by, both these are created by an uncreated permanent substance called God. That's all Descartes. These two substances are, all three substances indeed, they're all very different. They have no common property, especially mind and matter. And so they cannot interact with each other. Hence, how do we know that the world exists and the mind and spirit can, or mind and matter can interact? Mind and body can interact? Descartes' solution is again God. The two substances can interact because all that is the function of God. Now, Descartes considered that mental representations have two types of qualities. One is primary quality. Primary qualities are quantifiable and objective properties like extension. Properties of extension like length, extension in space like length, breadth, and so on. The other type of quality is secondary quality, unquantifiable, subjective qualities like color, smell, taste. However, the question then for Descartes is, how can mental representation of an object be extended in space, because mind is not extendable in space? Descartes' answer is again God. God is the God plays the function for me as the maker of these things happen. So Descartes resolved the problem of change, the original Parmenidean problem of change in the world of experience, by invoking God. But since God is responsible for all change, for the modern philosophers also, just like the Greeks, according to Hargrove, nature preservation is not required. No attempt from the part of the human being is required. God will do this task. So, unsatisfied with the Cartesian conception of God-dependent matter, later philosophers stopped discussing matter at all, and they considered the existence of matter as quite doubtful. So they only concentrated on God, or on mind, human mind, and reason. For example, the empiricists like William Berkeley of England, primary and secondary qualities are of objects that we experience are all subjective. Experience of the object is itself subjective, though the experience starts from sense perception. What existed are merely ideas within the subject. So Berkeley is a subjective idealist, an empiricist who is a subjective idealist. For David Hume, on the other hand, what is trustworthy, what are trustworthy are sensations and impressions, which means finally ideas. Perhaps the most important modern philosopher, 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant, for him, the external world was uh, uh, important at least as noumena, which is unknowable. What is knowable for the human mind are all phenomena. So noumena is not knowable, but at least it is there. So there is a status given to the world as the unknowable noumena by Immanuel Kant. Later philosophers of the 19th century, they all embraced idealism in one sense or the other, mostly. Of course, there are philosophers like Karl Marx, they do not embrace idealism, but most of the other philosophers, metaphysicians, they accepted idealism like Hegel. According to idealism, existence is basically mental. So we have to wait till 20th century to see philosophies that are really respectful of the world and nature. Hargrove discusses the relation between science and environmental thought. Today, the science of ecology shapes our environmental perspective. This was not the case for a long time. And Hargrove thinks that even though ecology has taken over, it's not very favorable to nature because its assumptions, philosophical assumptions, are same as those of the modern era, which are very Cartesian. So early scientists like Descartes, Galileo, and Kepler, they didn't place much value on observation, experiment, and so on. But they were placing all emphasis on mathematical reasoning, geometrical method, as it is called, which emphasizes measurable physical properties and indestructibility of matter without any reference to time. So they took away the element of time in order to get proper measurement of matter. So early modern science was quite reductionist. What is meant by reductionism? It is a Cartesian method, which he discusses in a book called Discourse of Method. The method of reducing complex ideas into simple forms, simple parts, break them, analyze them, divide them through the use of reason. This method showed actually great success in physics, in chemistry, and also in technological activities of modern period. And it still continues, the faith in this kind of method. But this kind of method, according to Hargrove, has many problems which have real impact and effect on environmental thinking. What are these problems? First, the sciences of natural history, like biology, geology, ecology, these follow the method of observation. And these sciences, therefore, do not fit into the model of reductionist analysis. Second, unlike the other sciences like physics and chemistry, time is an important element of sciences like geology and biology, because they describe natural processes which are taking time. And because they're looking at temporally unfolding natural processes, These processes are shown to be contingent and non-universal, and many aspects of non-universal aspects of nature are coming to the fore with their method. And thirdly, because they did not produce truly universal knowledge like physics and chemistry, these kind of sciences were treated with contempt by scientists and philosophers of the time. These sciences also concentrated on secondary qualities like color and smell. And so they had more in common with poets and painters and aestheticians. So that aesthetic element which came to be absent in modern thinking came back with them, according to Hargrove. Through these natural history sciences like geology and biology, modern science is beginning to have an environmental perspective, according to Hargrove. But these sciences do not fit into the preferred model of reductionist analysis. Hence, there is still inhibition of the environmental concern, according to Hargrove. Mainstream science is too idealistic and abstract and not friendly to natural history sciences. And there is the dichotomy or division between fact and value introduced by modern philosophy. So the search for scientific objectivity, which is central to modern science, it favors facts rather than value. So the scientific era has diminished the importance of value. They're not saying values were given or the highest importance in the earlier periods, and they were all very moral. That's not the argument. In the beginning of the 20th century, in the 1920s and so on, there were a group of philosophers called logical positivists. They introduced a strict verification principle for philosophical statements, just as in the sciences. So they were very scientific philosophers. And they rejected value statements as nonsensical. They are philosophers of language. What is sensible statement and what is sensible proposition and what is not is their inquiry. So they consider value statements, value propositions as nonsensical. Galileo and Descartes emphasized primary qualities in order to obtain objective knowledge about nature without interference from subjective factors. And that came to be again reinforced and reiterated in the period of the logical positivists. But the distinction between fact and value finally, objective knowledge and subjective knowledge in people like Galileo and Descartes, that finally gave rise to an unbridgeable dichotomy between fact and value within the modern philosophical period. David Hume, an important empiricist philosopher, English philosopher, emphasized the distinction between fact and value, and he wrote about it, and this distinction came to stay. So fact is the field of science, and value is the field of humanities. Until the 19th century, the scientists also had an important element of humanities training. So this was done away with in the 19th century when truly the modern disciplines were born. For what? So that the scientist's objectivity may be retained and protected. So by the 20th century, this practice of scientists not doing any humanities came to stay as an established practice. Hargrove, our author, cites passages from Darwin's autobiography. Here, in these passages that Hargrove has quoted, Darwin says he was educated in the humanities, but his later focus only on the on science and scientific training and practice. According to Darwin, these made him like a machine. And According to Darwin, this kind of a training does injury to moral character and emotional nature of the human beings. So Hargrove cites at the same time, Hargrove cites passages from Darwin, which speak about the extermination of the tribes in South America. And these tribes were still unaffected by modern civilization. So Darwin speaks in support of modernizing them, or exterminating them in these tribal ways. Now, Hargrove quotes these passages in order to show what a numbed or insensitive sense of objectivity can do to people. And Hargrove also criticizes the disappearance of aesthetics from philosophical curriculum of the 20th century. Finally, we come to environmental philosophy a little bit. Other lectures of the course will be more on this. Now, it is well known that most of our disciplines like physics branched off from philosophy, and even up to Newton's time, physics was called natural philosophy. And these sciences are the foundation of modern and philosophy is the foundation of modern science and modern culture in the way we have described it. But Hargrove thinks that the lack of an environment-friendly culture also is a contribution of Western philosophy. He thinks that Western philosophy has positively delimited, delegitimized environmental thought and natural histories of history sciences like geology and biology and ecology. So mainstream philosophy, according to him, is still in a denial mode. But this may not be true because the reading I've given you is from 1989. Later, of course, there's a lot of change. So this attitude is not helpful, going in a denial mode. Environmental philosophy should be acting as the rectification of the historical error of Western philosophy and Western thinking, which has become global. So Hargrove cites an attempt to found environmental philosophy in a school of thought called the solipsism, which is a very radical denial of anything external to the self. Only self, that is solus ipse, exists. So this kind of an attempt shows to Hargrove that philosophy is in dire straits. It is in dire need of a vibrant environmental orientation. Better than, going back to solipsism, even for environmental justification. So current environmental philosophy began in America in the 1970s. Now, environmental philosophy's birth in the 20th century, in the 1970s, is occasioned by the environmental crisis. And it happened in the most symbolic place, America, which is the epitome of this crisis, environmental crisis, because of its high industrialization. Environmental philosophy is driven by the slogan to get rid of human centrism from philosophy and culture. All beings must be considered valuable, and the techno-scientific culture must be deconstructed, is the argument of environmental philosophy. Trying to find value in nature is a kind of argument that very often we see in environmental ethics. The modern culture is real for all of us, whether we are living in India or in America. And it is not only true of the scientists and technologists. It's not a special attitude of the scientist, but it's a cultural attitude of everyone. Hence, philosophy today calls for a change of this cultural attitude, this cultural filter, a change of paradigm. Now, we all know that modernity and development is a boon for humanity. All that we see, this computer and the whole of Indian Institute of Technology, which Nehru established for the purpose of technological advancement of our newly born nation. All this is, in fact, a curse for the planet. The planet would be very happy if no development, no modernity was there, but human beings wouldn't be. Do you know what was the average life expectancy of an Indian at the time of India's independence in 1947? It was just 32 years. You shouldn't be hearing me wrong. It was 32 years. Today it is nearly 70. So this is what modernity, modern medicine, for example, has done to us. But to the planet, it is a curse. Therefore, and how this curse is manifested, especially through technology. That's why we are introducing environmental philosophy to technologists like you, not simply technologists, but technology leaders. So modernity and development must be tailored, but must be tweaked in such a way as to allow the planet and the environment to live on and survive. As far as we know, this planet, this blue planet, is the only place, only home of life. Maybe there are other planets where there is life, but we still don't know them. And therefore, it is our responsibility as conscious beings to protect this home of life. I stop there with this Native American proverb. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children, so that we need to hand over it to the next generation. Thank you so much for